My name is Rachel Taylor, and the moment I realized my life had to change wasn't when she grabbed my hair and yanked me off the ground in front of everyone at the coffee shop. It wasn't even when my boyfriend Jake stood there watching it happen without lifting a finger to help me. It was 3 hours later, sitting in my car in the parking lot of my apartment complex, staring at the clumps of my own brown hair scattered across my passenger seat, that I finally understood I'd been living in a nightmare disguised as a relationship. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The red welts on my scalp were still burning, and every time I touched the tender spots where she'd ripped chunks of hair right from the roots, I could feel my hands trembling. Not from fear anymore, but from something deep, something that felt like rage mixed with clarity, like I'd been sleepwalking through my own life and someone had just slapped me awake. That morning had started like any other Tuesday in my carefully orchestrated routine of avoiding conflict. I'd woken up in my studio apartment on Maple Street, the same cramped space I'd been renting for 2 years because Jake said moving in together was too big a step even though we'd been dating for 18 months. I'd made my usual breakfast of toast and instant coffee, checking my phone obsessively for any sign that Jake might actually want to see me that day, instead of spending another evening with his friends while I sat home wondering what I'd done wrong this time. Working at Henderson Marketing had become my refuge, the one place where I felt competent and valued, where my ideas mattered and my voice carried weight. I'd started there right out of college as a junior account coordinator, and 3 years later I'd worked my way up to managing some of our biggest clients. My boss, Patricia, had even hinted that a promotion was coming, that all my late nights and weekend projects were finally going to pay off in a way that would change my financial situation completely. But Jake never seemed impressed by any of it. When I'd tell him about landing a new account or getting praise from Patricia, he'd just nod and change the subject to something about his job at the auto shop, or worse, he'd find some way to minimize what I'd accomplished. He had this way of making me feel like I was bragging when all I wanted was for the person I loved to be proud of me. That Tuesday, I'd gotten a text from him around noon asking if I wanted to meet him at Brewster's Cafe after work. It was the first time in 2 weeks he'd initiated plans with me, and I felt this pathetic surge of excitement, like maybe things were finally going to get better between us. I'd even left work early, something I never did, because I wanted to look perfect when I saw him. Brewster's was this little coffee shop downtown that Jake and I used to go to when we first started dating, back when he'd hold my hand across the table and listen to me talk about my dreams of running my own marketing firm someday. I'd chosen a table by the window, the same one where he'd first told me he loved me, and I'd ordered his favorite drink along with mine, hoping to remind him of all the good times we'd had together. When he walked in 20 minutes late, I could tell immediately that something was off. His jaw was set in that way that meant he was angry about something, and instead of sitting across from me like he usually did, he slumped into the chair beside me and barely looked in my direction. I asked him how his day was, trying to keep my voice light and cheerful, but he just grunted something about his manager being an idiot. I was still trying to figure out what I'd done wrong when she walked in. Melissa Chen, the girl Jake worked with at the auto shop, the one he'd been mentioning more and more often in our conversation. She was everything I wasn't, confident in a way that seemed effortless, with long black hair that looked like she'd stepped out of a shampoo commercial and clothes that fit her perfectly without trying too hard. Jake's entire demeanor changed the second he saw her. His shoulders straightened and this smile spread across his face that I hadn't seen directed at me in months. He stood up and waved her over, and when she reached our table, he didn't introduce me as his girlfriend. He just said, "Melissa, this is Rachel," like I was some random acquaintance he'd happened to run into. She looked me up and down with this expression that made me feel like I was being evaluated and found lacking. Her eyes lingered on my work clothes, the conservative blouse and slacks I'd worn to the office that morning, and I could see her taking inventory of everything from my shoes to my hair to the way I was sitting. When she finally smiled, it was the kind of smile that doesn't reach your eyes, the kind that says she's already decided you're not worth her time. Jake offered her the chair he'd been sitting in, which meant I was now facing both of them while they talked about people from work I didn't know, and inside jokes I wasn't part of. Every time I tried to join the conversation, Melissa would either ignore me completely or respond with this tone that made it clear she thought I was interrupting something important. After about 10 minutes of this, I excused myself to go to the bathroom, partly because I needed a moment to collect myself, and partly because I hoped Jake would notice I was upset and maybe remember I was supposed to be the person he was spending time with. When I came back, they were sitting closer together and Melissa had her hand on Jake's arm while she laughed at something he'd said. I stood there for a moment, watching them, feeling like I was invisible. Jake glanced up at me and gestured vaguely toward my chair, but he didn't move away from Melissa or ask what was wrong when he saw the expression on my face. I sat down and tried to act normal, but something inside me was starting to crack. That's when Melissa turned to me with that fake smile again and said, "Jake's told me so much about you. It's interesting finally meeting the girl who's been keeping him so busy." The way she said it made it sound like I was some kind of burden, like I was the reason Jake couldn't have fun or be himself. I felt my face flush, but I managed to say something polite about how nice it was to meet her too. Jake just sat there, saying nothing, and I realized he wasn't going to defend me or clarify that we were in a relationship. He was going to let her talk to me however she wanted, and he was going to pretend like it was perfectly normal. Melissa kept going, asking me questions that sounded friendly on the surface but felt like tiny knives. She wanted to know about my job, my apartment, whether I had plans for the weekend, and every answer I gave seemed to amuse her in some private way. When I mentioned that I was hoping to get promoted soon, she exchanged a look with Jake and said, "That's so sweet. Jake was just telling me how you're always talking about work. You must really love it there." The way she said, "really love it," made it sound like she thought I was some kind of workaholic with no life outside the office, and I saw Jake smirk like he agreed with her assessment. I wanted to explain that I worked hard because I was good at my job, because I was building something for myself, but I could tell neither of them cared about the distinction. As the conversation went on, I started to feel smaller and smaller, like I was shrinking into my chair while they built this bubble around themselves that I couldn't penetrate. Melissa kept touching Jake's arm or shoulder when she talked, and he kept leaning toward her like he was hanging on every word she said. They had this easy chemistry that made me feel like a third wheel at what was supposed to be my own day. I finally worked up the courage to suggest that maybe we should order some food, thinking that if we had something to do with our hands, the dynamic might shift. But Melissa looked at her watch and said she actually had to leave soon. She just wanted to stop by and say hi, because Jake had mentioned they were going to be here. That's when it hit me that this wasn't a coincidence. Jake had planned this, had invited her to join us without telling me, had set up this whole situation where I'd be forced to watch him flirt with another woman while pretending like nothing was happening. The realization made my stomach drop, and I felt this wave of humiliation wash over me that was so intense I thought I might actually be sick. I stood up abruptly and said I needed to get some air, hoping Jake would follow me or at least ask if I was okay. But he just nodded and turned back to Melissa, continuing their conversation like I'd never been there at all. I walked outside and stood on the sidewalk, breathing deeply and trying to figure out what I was supposed to do next. Through the window I could see them talking animatedly, both of them laughing at something that was apparently hilarious. Melissa had moved into my empty chair, and they were sitting so close together their knees were almost touching. Jake looked happier than I'd seen him in months, more alive and engaged than he ever was when it was just the two of us. I should have left then. I should have walked to my car and driven home and had a serious conversation with myself about why I was staying in a relationship with someone who clearly didn't respect me or want to be with me. But instead I went back inside telling myself I was being paranoid, that I was overreacting to what was probably just a friendly work colleague stopping by to chat. When I sat back down, Melissa was in the middle of telling Jake about some party she was having this weekend, and how she hoped he could make it because it would be so much fun. She turned to me with that same false smile and said, "You should come too, Rach. It might be good for you to get out and meet some new people." The condescension in her voice was unmistakable, like she was talking to a child who needed to be encouraged to socialize. But what made it worse was the way Jake immediately started making excuses about why I probably wouldn't want to come, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. How I usually like to stay in on weekends and catch up on work or watch movies. He was describing me like I was some kind of hermit, someone too boring and antisocial to fit in with his fun, exciting friends. I opened my mouth to say that I'd love to come, that I enjoyed parties and meeting new people, but Melissa cut me off before I could speak. She said, "Oh, that's okay. Some people just aren't party people. There's nothing wrong with that." But the way she said it made it clear she thought there was everything wrong with that she saw me as someone who was fundamentally lacking in the qualities that made life interesting. That's when something inside me finally snapped. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, decisive way that felt like a door closing in my mind. I looked at Jake, really looked at him, and saw him clearly for maybe the first time in months. He was enjoying. He liked having two women compete for his attention. Liked being the center of this little drama where one woman was obviously superior to the other. I stood up again, but this time I didn't make excuses. I just said I was leaving, and I started gathering my purse and jacket. Jake finally seemed to notice that something was actually wrong, and he asked if I was feeling okay, but his tone was more annoyed than concerned, like I was disrupting something important. I told him I was fine, just tired, and I'd talk to him later. Melissa made some comment about how it was so nice to finally meet me, her voice dripping with false sincerity, and I managed to nod politely without saying anything that would give away how much I wanted to tell her exactly what I thought of her little performance. I was halfway to the door when I heard Jake say something to Melissa about how I'd been really stressed at work lately, his tone suggesting that this explained my behavior and that she shouldn't take my abrupt departure personally. The fact that he was already making excuses for me, already explaining away my feelings to protect her comfort, was the final confirmation that I meant nothing to him. I pushed through the door and walked quickly toward my car, my hands shaking with anger and humiliation. Behind me I could hear the door open again, and I thought maybe Jake was finally coming after me. Maybe he'd realized he'd gone too far and wanted to apologize. But when I turned around, it was Melissa standing on the sidewalk, not Jake. She had this expression on her face that was different from the fake politeness she'd been wearing inside. This was sharper, more honest, like she'd dropped the pretense now that we were alone. She walked toward me slowly, and I could see something in her eyes that made me take a step back instinctively. When she got close enough that no one else could hear her, she said in a voice that was calm and measured, "I want you to know that Jake and I have been seeing each other for 3 months. He's been planning to break up with you for weeks, but he feels sorry for you, so he keeps putting it off. You're making this harder on everyone by hanging around when it's obvious he doesn't want to be with you anymore." The words hit me like physical blows, each one designed to cause maximum damage. But it was the casual way she delivered them that really broke something inside me, like she was commenting on the weather instead of destroying what I thought was the most important relationship in my life. I stared at her, trying to process what she'd just said, trying to figure out if she was telling the truth or just trying to hurt me, but looking at her face, seeing the satisfaction in her eyes, I knew she wasn't lying. Jake had been cheating on me for 3 months, and instead of having the decency to end things with me, he'd been stringing me along while building a relationship with someone else. I found my voice and asked her why she was telling me this, why she cared whether I knew or not. She shrugged and said, "Because watching you try so hard to keep his attention is embarrassing for everyone. You're better off knowing the truth so you can move on with your life and stop making a fool of yourself." The cruelty of it took my breath away. She wasn't telling me to be kind or to spare me further pain. She was telling me because she wanted to see me break, wanted to watch me crumble under the weight of knowing how pathetic I'd been. She was enjoying this, getting some kind of satisfaction from being the one to deliver the killing blow to whatever was left of my self-respect. I turned to walk away, but she wasn't done. She called my name, and when I looked back she had this smile on her face that made my skin crawl. She said, "Oh, and Rachel, Jake asked me to tell you that he won't be able to make it to your company party next week. He'll be busy that night." I knew exactly what party she was talking about. Henderson Marketing's annual celebration, the one where they were going to announce promotions and new partnerships. I'd been looking forward to it for months, Had bought a new dress specifically because I wanted Jake to be proud to be seen with me when Patricia introduced me as one of the company's rising stars. Jake had promised weeks ago that he'd be there, had even asked about what kind of food they'd be serving and whether he should wear a tie. The fact that he'd been planning all along not to show up, that he'd asked his new girlfriend to break the news to me, was such a calculated cruelty that it left me speechless. I managed to get to my car without falling apart completely, but once I was safely inside with the doors locked, I let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. 3 months. He'd been lying to my face for 3 months, letting me believe we were working through our problems while he was building a new life with someone else. Every late night he'd claimed to be working overtime. Every weekend he'd said he needed space to hang out with his friends. Every time he'd been distant or distracted when we were together. It all made sense now. I'd been blaming myself, thinking I wasn't interesting enough or supportive enough or attractive enough to keep his attention, but the truth was, he'd already moved on, and I'd been performing for an audience of one who'd stopped watching months ago. I sat there in my car for over an hour going through every conversation, every text message, every moment from the last 3 months, seeing all the signs I'd missed or explained away, the way he'd stopped saying he loved me, the way he'd started picking fights over stupid things, like he was trying to create distance between us, the way he'd become critical of everything from my clothes to my career ambitions, to the way I spent my free time. But what hurt the most wasn't even the cheat, it was the realization that the person I'd thought I was in love with didn't actually exist. The Jake I'd been clinging to, the one who used to make me laugh and tell me I was beautiful and talk about our future together, had been replaced by someone who saw me as a burden to be managed, a problem to be solved, an inconvenience to be tolerated until he worked up the courage to discard me completely. By the time I finally drove home, the sun was setting, and I felt like I'd lived through several lifetimes in the span of a few hours. My apartment looked different when I walked in, smaller and sadder, like it was reflecting back all the ways I'd been settling for less than I deserved. The framed photo of Jake and me on my nightstand suddenly looked like evidence of my own delusion, proof of how thoroughly I'd been lying to myself about the state of my life. I called in sick to work the next day, something I'd never done unless I was actually bedridden with fever, but I couldn't imagine sitting in meetings and pretending to care about marketing strategies when my entire world had been turned upside down. Instead, I spent the day in my pajamas, alternating between crying and feeling completely numb, trying to figure out what I was supposed to do next. That's when I started thinking about the company party, about how excited I'd been to share this moment with someone I thought loved me, and how humiliating it would be to show up alone after spending weeks telling my colleagues about the boyfriend who'd be accompanying me. The thought of facing Patricia and my coworkers, of having to explain why Jake wasn't there, or worse, having to pretend everything was fine, made me feel sick all over again. But as the day wore on, something else started growing alongside the humiliation and heartbreak. It was anger, but not the helpless kind I'd felt sitting in that coffee shop watching Jake flirt with Melissa. This was different, more focused, like a fire that had been smoldering for months and was finally getting enough oxygen to really burn. I was angry at Jake for lying to me, for wasting months of my life, for making me doubt myself and my worth. I was angry at Melissa for the cruel way she'd delivered the news, for taking pleasure in my pain, for acting like I was some pathetic obstacle standing in the way of true love. But mostly I was angry at myself for accepting so little, for believing I deserved to be treated like an afterthought, for staying in a relationship that had been making me smaller and sadder with each passing day. That anger felt clean in a way that surprised me, like it was burning away all the confusion and self-doubt that had been clouding my judgment for months. For the first time since I'd started dating Jake, I felt like I could see clearly, like I was finally thinking with my own mind instead of through the lens of what would make him happy or keep him interested. I realized I had a choice to make. I could let this destroy, could retreat into my apartment and my job and convince myself that this was just how relationships worked, that everyone got their heart broken and the smart thing to do was to lower my expectations and be grateful for whatever scraps of affection someone was willing to throw my way. Or I could decide that I was worth more than that I deserved to be with someone who chose me every day, who was proud to be seen with me,
who wouldn't make me compete for basic respect and consideration. I could decide that Jake and Melissa had actually done me a favor by showing me exactly who they were, by freeing me from a relationship that was slowly killing my spirit. The more I thought about it, the more I realized the last 18 months hadn't been about love at all. They'd been about me trying to earn something that should have been freely given, trying to prove I was worthy of affection and commitment from someone who'd never had any intention of providing either. I'd been so focused on being the perfect girlfriend that I'd forgotten to ask whether Jake was being a decent boyfriend to me. As I sat there in my living room, surrounded by the evidence of a life I'd been living for someone else's approval, I made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff and growing wings at the same time. I was done begging for love from people who didn't value me. I was done making myself smaller to fit into spaces that were never meant for me. I was done being grateful for crumbs when I deserved the whole damn cake. The company party was still 5 days away and Patricia was still planning to announce my promotion. I was going to be there and I was going to celebrate my success. And I was going to do it without needing Jake or anyone else to validate my worth. For the first time in months, I felt excited about something that had nothing to do with trying to fix a broken relationship. I picked up my phone and scrolled to Jake's number, staring at it for a long time before I started typing. The message I sent was short and to the point. I know about Melissa, don't contact me again. I hit send before I could second guess myself, and then I blocked his number so I wouldn't be tempted to read whatever excuse or half apology he might send back. Then I did something I hadn't done in over a year. I called my sister Emma, who lived across town and who I'd been seeing less and less of because Jake always seemed to have some reason why we couldn't make plans with my family. Emma picked up on the second ring, and the moment I heard her voice I started crying again. But this time it felt different, like I was crying because I was relieved to remember that there were people in my life who actually cared about me. Emma listened while I told her everything, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment before she said, "Rachel, I have to tell you something. Mark and I never liked Jake. We thought he was treating you badly, but every time we tried to bring it up, you defended him, so we stopped trying. We've been waiting for you to see what we could see." Hearing that was painful and comforting at the same time. Painful because it meant I'd been so obvious in my denial that even my family had noticed, but comforting because it meant I wasn't crazy, that the things I'd been feeling weren't just me being paranoid or demanding too much. Emma insisted on coming over that night with takeout and wine, and for the first time in months I felt like myself again. We talked about everything except Jake and Melissa, and I remembered what it felt like to laugh without worrying about whether I was being too loud or too silly, or too much of anything. Emma reminded me of dreams I'd had before I started focusing all my energy on being the kind of woman Jake might want to keep around. When she left that night, she hugged me tight and said, "I'm proud of you for finally putting yourself first. You're going to be okay, better than okay." And for the first time since this whole nightmare started, I believed her.
The next few days passed in a blur of rediscovering what it felt like to make decisions based on what I wanted instead of what would avoid conflict or disappoint someone else. I went shopping for a new dress for the company party, something bold and beautiful that I chose because I loved it, not because I was worried about whether it was too much or too little. I made plans with coworkers I'd been neglecting, accepted invitations I'd been turning down because Jake didn't want to go. But on Friday afternoon, something happened that changed everything again. I was leaving the office later than usual, working on a presentation for Monday's client meeting, when I saw Jake's truck in the parking lot. He was leaning against it, clearly waiting for me, and the sight of him made my stomach lurch even though I'd thought I was past the worst of the emotional fallout. I considered going back inside and waiting for him to leave, but something stubborn in me refused to hide. This was my workplace, my life, and I wasn't going to let him make me feel unsafe in spaces that belonged to me. So I walked toward my car, keeping my head high and my expression neutral, hoping he'd get the message that I had nothing to say to him. But Jake had other plans. He pushed himself off his truck and started walking toward me, calling my name in that tone he used when he wanted something from me. I didn't stop or acknowledge him, just kept moving toward my car, but he was faster and he reached me before I could get my keys out. When I turned to face him, I was shocked by how different he looked. Not physically, but something in his expression was desperate in a way I'd never seen before. His eyes were bloodshot like he hadn't been sleeping, and he had this manic energy that made me take a step back instinctively. He started talking immediately, words tumbling out like he'd been rehearsing them for days. He said he'd made a mistake, that Melissa didn't mean anything to him, that he'd been confused and scared about how serious things were getting between us. He said he loved me, that he'd always loved me, and that if I'd just give him another chance, he'd prove that I was the only one who mattered. I stood there listening to him, and the strangest thing happened. Instead of feeling relieved or vindicated or even angry, I felt his words washed over me like noise, and I realized that somewhere in the last few days, I'd stopped caring what Jake thought about anything. The power he'd had over my emotions, over my sense of self-worth, had simply evaporated. When he finally stopped talking, I looked at him calmly and said, "I don't want to be with you anymore, Jake. What you did wasn't a mistake, it was a choice you made every day for 3 months. And I'm making a choice too. I'm choosing to be with someone who values me enough not to lie to me, or cheat on me, or make me compete for basic respect." His face changed then, the desperation giving way to something uglier. He said I was being dramatic, that everyone made mistakes, that I was throwing away the best relationship I'd ever had over something that didn't even matter anymore. When I didn't respond to that, he tried a different approach, telling me I'd never find anyone else who'd put up with my workaholic tendencies and my need to always be right about everything. That's when I realized this wasn't about winning me back at all. This was about his ego, about not being able to handle the fact that I'd been the one to end things, that I'd refused to accept the scraps he was offering and had chosen to walk away instead. He didn't want me back because he loved me, or missed me. He wanted me back because losing me meant admitting that he'd made a mistake, that he'd given up something valuable for something temporary. I told him I was leaving, and I started walking toward my car again, but Jake wasn't done. He grabbed my arm, not hard enough to hurt but firmly enough to stop me from moving, and said I wasn't going anywhere until we finished talking. The fact that he thought he had the right to physically prevent me from leaving, that he could just decide I had to stand there and listen to him until he was satisfied, was so presumptuous it took my breath away. I pulled my arm free and told him not to touch me, but he just laughed like I was being ridiculous. He said we'd been together for 18 months, that he had a right to an explanation, that I owed him at least that much after everything he'd done for me. The entitlement in his voice, the way he talked about our relationship like it was a debt I owed him, instead of something that was supposed to make both our lives better, made me realize how fundamentally he misunderstood what love actually was. That's when Melissa appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, walking across the parking lot toward us with this satisfied smile on her face like she was enjoying the show. She'd clearly been waiting somewhere nearby, probably in Jake's truck, and had decided this was the perfect moment to make her presence known. She came right up to us, slipped her arm through Jake's like she was claiming her territory, and said in that same condescending tone I remembered from the coffee shop,
"Is everything okay here?"
"Rachel, you look upset." The fake concern in her voice was so transparent it would have been laughable if the situation weren't so infuriating. Looked at both of them standing there, Jake looking embarrassed and angry that his grand gesture had been interrupted, Melissa looking like she was savoring every moment of my humiliation, and I felt something crystallize inside me. They deserved each other. They were both manipulative and cruel and selfish, and they'd found their perfect match in each other. I started to walk away again, but Melissa called after me, her voice dropping all pretense of politeness. She said, "You know, Jake told me you'd probably react like this. He said you were always overly dramatic about everything, that you never knew when to let things go." I can see what he meant. I stopped walking, not because I was hurt by what she'd said, but because I was tired of being talked about like I wasn't standing right there, tired of being the target of their little power games, tired of pretending like their behavior was something I had to tolerate in silence. I turned around and looked directly at Melissa, and for the first time since I'd met her, I didn't try to be polite or diplomatic or considerate of her feelings. I said, "You're absolutely right. I am dramatic. I'm dramatic enough to think I deserve a boyfriend who doesn't cheat on me. I'm dramatic enough to expect basic honesty and respect in my relationships. I'm dramatic enough to believe that love shouldn't require me to compete with other women for attention. If that makes me difficult to deal with, then I'm okay with that. Melissa's smile faltered slightly, like she hadn't expected me to fight back, but she recovered quickly. She said, "Look, I get that you're hurt, but you can't blame Jake for falling out of love with you. Sometimes these things just happen. The mature thing to do would be to accept it and move on instead of making a scene in a parking lot." The way she said mature made it clear she thought I was behaving like a child, that the adult response to being cheated on and lied to was to graciously step aside and wish them well. The condescension was so thick, I could practically taste it, and I realized she was enjoying this, getting some kind of satisfaction from explaining to me why I should be grateful for the way they'd treated me. That's when something inside me snapped complete, not in a violent way, but in a decisive way, like a rubber band that had been stretched too far finally breaking free. I was done being the reasonable one, the understanding one, the one who absorbed other people's cruelty and tried to find ways to excuse it. I looked at Melissa and said in a voice that was perfectly calm, "You're right about one thing. Jake did fall out of love with me, but he fell out of love with me months before he fell in love with you, and instead of being honest about it, he decided to string me along while he figured out what he wanted. That's not romantic, it's cowardly. And the fact that you're proud of being with someone who treats people that way tells me everything I need to know about who you are." Jake tried to interrupt, to say something about how I was twisting the situation, but I wasn't finished. I kept looking at Melissa as I continued. "You seem to think you've won something here, but all you've really done is prove that you're willing to settle for someone who lies and cheats when things get difficult. Good luck with that. I'm sure it'll work out great for you." Melissa's face flushed red, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked less than perfectly composed. She took a step toward me and I could see something dangerous flickering in her eyes, like she was barely keeping herself under control. She said in a voice that was low and threatening, "You don't know anything about me or about what Jake and I have together. You're just bitter because you couldn't keep your man interested. Maybe if you'd been less boring and more fun to be around, none of this would have happened." The words were designed to cut deep, to make me question everything about myself and my worth as a partner. 6 months ago they probably would have worked. 6 months ago I would have taken those words and turned them over in my mind for weeks, looking for ways they might be true, finding new reasons to blame myself for the failure of my relationship. But standing there in that parking lot, looking at this woman who thought cruelty was a form of power, I felt nothing but pity for her. She was so insecure about her place in Jake's life that she needed to tear me down to feel better about herself. She was so threatened by the history Jake and I shared, that she had to convince herself I was inferior in every way that mattered. I started to say something back, something about how someone who really felt secure in their relationship wouldn't need to attack their partner's ex. But before I could get the words out, Melissa lunged forward and grabbed a handful of my hair. The shock of it was almost as bad as the pain. I felt her fingers twist into the hair at the back of my head, and then she yanked upward so hard that my feet actually left the ground for a moment. The burning sensation across my scalp was immediate and intense, and I could feel individual strands snapping as she pulled with all her strength. I grabbed her wrist with both hands, trying to break her grip, but she held on tight, using my hair like a leash to jerk my head back and forth. She was saying something, screaming at me about how I needed to learn to keep my mouth shut, but I couldn't focus on her words because the pain was so overwhelming. What made it worse was the realization that this was happening in the parking lot of my workplace, where any of my colleagues could see it, where the security cameras were definitely recording every second. The humiliation of being physically attacked was compounded by the knowledge that this moment would follow me, that people would see me as the woman who got into a hair-pulling fight like some kind of teenage. I could hear Jake's voice somewhere behind me, but he wasn't telling Melissa to stop or trying to break us apart. He was just saying my name over and over, like he was annoyed that his girlfriend was making a scene but didn't want to actually do anything about it. The fact that he was letting this happen, that he was standing there watching another woman assault me without intervening, was almost more shocking than the attack itself. The drive home from the parking lot felt like moving through a dream, the kind where everything looks normal but nothing makes sense. My hands were still shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, and every time I stopped at a red light,
I'd catch sight of myself in the rearview mirror and see the wild look in my eyes, the way my hair was sticking up in strange directions where chunks had been ripped out. I kept replaying what had happened, trying to make it feel real. Melissa had actually grabbed my hair and yanked me around like we were in some kind of bar fight. She'd done it in broad daylight, in front of security cameras, with Jake standing right there watching it happen. The whole thing felt so surreal that part of me wondered if I'd imagined it, if the stress of the breakup had finally caused me to snap and hallucinate the entire confrontation. But when I touched the tender spots on my scalp, when I saw the clumps of brown hair scattered across my passenger seat, I knew it had really happened. A grown woman had physically attacked me because I'd refused to quietly disappear from her boyfriend's life, because I dared to suggest that maybe being proud of stealing someone else's partner wasn't the victory she thought it was. When I finally made it inside my apartment, I went straight to the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror. My hair looked like I'd stuck my finger in an electrical socket, with bald patches visible where Melissa had ripped out entire sections. There were scratch marks on my neck from her fingernails, and the collar of my work blouse was torn where she'd grabbed it while trying to get a better grip on my hair. I looked like a victim, and the sight made me angrier than anything else that had happened. Not angry at Melissa exactly, though she certainly deserved it. I was angry at myself for being surprised, for not seeing this coming, for thinking that people like Jake and Melissa would just let me walk away without trying to punish me for not playing by their rules. I should have known that standing up to them would have consequences. I should have realized that calling out their behavior would make them want to prove they could still hurt me, still control the narrative of what had happened between us. But some naive part of me had believed that if I just stayed calm and dignified, if I took the high road and refused to engage in their drama, they'd eventually lose interest and leave me alone. The phone rang while I was still standing in the bathroom, staring at my reflection and trying to figure out how to fix my hair enough to look presentable for work the next day. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was Jake calling to either apologize for what Melissa had done, or to blame me for provoking her somehow. But when I looked at the screen, it was my sister Emma's number. I picked up on the fourth ring, and before I could even say hello, Emma was talking. She said she'd been thinking about our conversation the other night, about how proud she was that I'd finally ended things with Jake, and she wanted to take me out to celebrate this weekend. Her voice was so bright and cheerful that I almost started crying just from the contrast with how I was feeling. When I didn't respond right away, Emma's tone changed. She asked if I was okay if something had happened, and there was something about the concern in her voice that broke down whatever walls I'd been trying to build around this situation. I found myself telling her everything, from Jake showing up at my work to Melissa grabbing my hair to the way I just stood there afterward, bleeding and humiliated while they drove away together. Emma was quiet for a long time after I finished talking, and when she finally spoke, her voice was cold in a way I'd never heard before. She said, "Rachel, that woman assaulted you, you know that, right? What she did wasn't just inappropriate or dramatic, it was assault. You could press charges." The word assault hit me like a physical blow. I'd been thinking of it as a fight, as some kind of unfortunate escalation that had gotten out of hand, but Emma was right. I hadn't touched Melissa, hadn't threatened her, hadn't done anything except use words to defend myself, and she'd responded by physically attacking me, by grabbing me, and causing actual bodily harm. I told Emma I didn't want to make it into a bigger deal than it already was, that I just wanted to put the whole thing behind me and move on with my life. But even as I said it, I could hear how weak it sounded, how much like the old version of myself who always chose peace over justice, who always prioritized other people's comfort over her own well-being. Emma didn't let me off the hook. She said, "So you're just going to let her get away with it? You're going to let her think she can put her hands on you whenever she doesn't like what you have to say? What happens the next time she sees you somewhere? What happens if she decides you're still too much of a threat to her relationship with Jay?" I hadn't thought about that, about the possibility that this wasn't a one-time explosion of temper but the beginning of a pattern. What if Melissa decided that humiliating me once wasn't enough? What if she started showing up at my workplace or my apartment, trying to intimidate me into staying away from places where I might run into Jake? The thought made my stomach turn, but it also made me realize something important. By not responding to what she'd done, by trying to pretend it hadn't happened or wasn't a big deal, I was essentially giving her permission to do it again. I was telling her that I was an acceptable target, that she could treat me however she wanted without facing any consequence. Emma must have sensed my hesitation because she pressed on. She said she'd been married to a police officer for 5 years, that she'd heard enough stories to know that people who were willing to assault strangers in public parking lots didn't usually stop at one incident. She said the fact that Melissa had done it in front of security cameras suggested either that she was too angry to think clearly, or that she didn't care about getting caught, and neither of those possibilities boded well for my safety. When we hung up, I sat on my couch for a long time, turning Emma's words over in my mind. Part of me wanted to listen to the voice in my head that said, filing a police report would just make everything more complicated, that it would drag out a situation I was trying to put behind me, that it would make me look vindictive and petty. But a larger part of me was tired of being the person who absorbed other people's bad behavior without fighting back. I was tired of being understanding and forgiving and mature when what I really wanted was for someone to acknowledge that what had happened to me was wrong, that I didn't deserve to be treated that way regardless of what had led up to it. I looked around my apartment, at the life I'd built for myself, at the job I loved and the dreams I was working toward, and I realized that if I didn't stand up for myself now, I'd be sending a message to the universe that I was okay with being treated as less than human. I'd be telling everyone, including myself, that my safety and dignity were negotiable, that maintaining peace was more important than demanding justice. That night, I called the non-emergency police line and explained what had happened. The officer who took my call was professional and sympathetic, and she walked me through the process of filing a report. She told me to come in the next morning with any evidence I had, including photos of my injuries and the security footage from my workplace if I could get access to it. When I hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, not quite peace, but a sense of agency, like I was finally taking control of a situation that had been spiraling beyond my ability to manage. For the first time since Jake had walked into that coffee shop, I felt like I was making choices based on what I needed, instead of what would cause the least trouble for everyone else. The next morning, I called in sick to work again, but this time, it wasn't because I was hiding from the world. I had things to do, steps to take, a case to build. I started by taking pictures of my scalp and neck, documenting the scratch marks and the bald patches where Melissa had ripped out my hair. It was humiliating to have to photograph my own injuries, but I forced myself to be thorough, because I knew that evidence would be important if this ever went to court. Then I called the security office at my workplace and explained that I needed copies of the footage from the previous evening's incident. The security supervisor, a kind older man named Frank, who'd always been friendly when I worked late, didn't ask too many questions. He just told me to come in through the side entrance around lunchtime, and he'd have everything ready for me. Getting dressed that morning was an exercise in damage control. I tried 3 different hairstyles before I found one that mostly covered the worst of the bald spots, and I had to use concealer to hide the scratches on my neck. Looking at myself in the mirror, I realized this was what trauma looked like on the outside. Not dramatic or obvious, just a woman trying to appear normal while dealing with something that had fundamentally changed how safe she felt in the world. The police station was busier than I'd expected, full of people dealing with crises that probably made my situation look trivial by comparison. But when I approached the front desk and explained why I was there, the receptionist treated me with the same seriousness she'd shown everyone else, and I was grateful for that small dignity. Officer Martinez, the woman I met with, was younger than I'd expected, but had an air of competence that immediately put me at ease. She listened while I walked through everything that had happened, from the initial confrontation at the coffee shop to the parking lot incident, taking notes and asking clarifying questions that helped me organize the timeline in my own mind. When I showed her the photos of my injuries, her expression hardened slightly. She said that what Melissa had done clearly constituted assault, that grabbing someone's hair and causing physical harm was a crime regardless of what words had been exchanged beforehand. She explained that I had the right to press charges, but that I should be prepared for the possibility that Melissa might try to file a counter-complaint, or claim that I'd provoked her somehow. The thought of having to defend myself, of having to prove that I hadn't done anything wrong, was exhausting before it even began, but Officer Martinez assured me that they'd review all the evidence, including the security footage, before deciding how to proceed. She said that in her experience, cases like this often came down to credibility, and the fact that I'd sought medical attention and filed a report immediately after the incident would work in my favor. I hadn't actually sought medical attention, and when I admitted that, Officer Martinez strongly recommended that I see a doctor as soon as possible. She explained that having medical documentation of my injuries would strengthen the case significantly, and that some injuries from hair-pulling incidents weren't immediately apparent, but could cause problems later if left untreated. The urgent care clinic was my next stop, and sitting in the waiting room, surrounded by people with obvious illnesses and injuries, made me feel like a fraud. What I'd experienced felt too small and personal to warrant medical attention, too much like a schoolyard fight to be taken seriously by healthcare professionals.
But Dr. Chen, the physician who examined me, treated my injuries with the same care she would have shown any other assault victim. She documented the location and severity of each scratch and bald patch, took additional photographs for my medical record, and prescribed a topical antibiotic to prevent infection in the deeper scratches. When she asked how the assault had happened, I found myself minimizing it again, describing it as a disagreement that got out of hand, rather than calling it what it was. But Dr. Chen stopped me gently and said, "Miss Taylor, what you're describing is assault. It doesn't matter what led up to it or how you feel about the person who did it. Someone put their hands on you without your consent and caused you physical harm. That's a crime, and you have every right to seek justice for it." Hearing a medical professional validate my experience in such clear terms was both a relief and a revelation. I'd spent so much energy trying to minimize what had happened, trying to convince myself that it wasn't that serious, that I'd almost talked myself out of believing it had been a big deal at all. But sitting in that exam room, looking at the clinical documentation of my injuries, I couldn't pretend anymore that this was just some unfortunate misunderstanding. Melissa had deliberately hurt me because she'd wanted to humiliate and intimidate me, and the fact that her actions had been captured on camera and documented by medical professionals meant that there would be consequences for what she'd done. When I left the clinic, I felt different. Not healed, exactly, but clearer about what had happened and what I needed to do next. The evidence was building, the case was taking shape, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt like I had some power in the situation. The security footage from my workplace was even more damning than I'd expected. Frank had isolated the relevant section and burned it onto a DVD for me, and when I watched it on my laptop that evening, I was shocked by how violent and unprovoked Melissa's attack looked from an outside perspective. The camera had captured everything from the moment Jake grabbed my arm to the moment Melissa finally let go of my hair. What struck me most was how calm and controlled I looked throughout the entire confrontation, and how obviously aggressive and unhinged Melissa. There was no way to watch that footage and conclude that I had somehow provoked or deserved what happened to me. I made several copies of the DVD and dropped one off at the police station the next morning. Officer Martinez reviewed it while I waited, and when she finished, she looked up at me with an expression that was both sympathetic and determined. She said, "Miss Taylor, this is one of the clearest cases of assault I've seen in a while. We're going to file charges against Ms. Chen, and I'm confident that the district attorney will decide to prosecute. You should prepare yourself for the possibility that this will go to trial, which means you'll need to testify about what happened." The thought of having to face Melissa in a courtroom, of having to relive the humiliation and fear I'd felt in that parking lot, made my stomach clench. But the alternative was letting her get away with attacking me, sending the message that my safety and dignity were worth less than avoiding conflict. Officer Martinez must have seen the hesitation in my face because she leaned forward and said, "I know this feels overwhelming, and I know it would be easier to just let it go, but people like Miss Chen count on their victims being too intimidated or too tired to fight back. Every time someone chooses not to press charges, it reinforces their belief that they can treat people however they want without facing consequences." She was right, and I knew it. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about establishing that there were boundaries, that certain behaviors were unacceptable regardless of the emotional context, that physical violence was never an appropriate response to words you didn't want to hear. Over the next few days, I threw myself into building the strongest case possible. I collected character references from colleagues and friends, documented every interaction I'd had with Jake and Melissa, and even reached out to Mr. Ortiz, my former neighbor, who confirmed that he'd witnessed some of Jake's controlling behavior during the time I'd lived in his neighborhood. The process was exhausting and emotionally draining, but it was also empowering in a way I hadn't expected. Instead of feeling like a victim of circumstances beyond my control, I felt like someone taking action to protect herself and hold others accountable for their choices. Emma was my constant source of support throughout this process, checking in every day and offering to help with anything from research to moral support to rides to various appointments. Having someone in my corner who believed in what I was doing made all the difference in maintaining my resolve when the task ahead felt overwhelming. About a week after I'd filed the initial report, Officer Martinez called to tell me that they'd served Melissa with the assault charges. She said Melissa had seemed shocked to receive the paperwork, that she'd apparently told the serving officer that I was making a big deal out of nothing, and that she barely even touched. The fact that Melissa was still minimizing what she'd done, still trying to frame it as my overreaction rather than her criminal behavior, only strengthened my conviction that I was doing the right thing. She clearly hadn't learned anything from the experience, hadn't developed any awareness of how serious her actions had been. A few days later, Jake called my work phone, presumably because I'd blocked his personal number. My assistant, Linda, took the message and told me he'd said it was urgent, that he needed to speak with me about a legal matter. I almost called him back out of curiosity, but Emma convinced me to route all communication through Officer Martinez instead. When I relayed the message to Officer Martinez, she wasn't surprised. She said it was common for assault defendants to try to pressure their victims into dropping charges, either through direct intimidation or through intermediaries, like mutual friends or family members. She advised me not to have any contact with either Jake or Melissa until after the case was resolved, and to report any attempts they made to contact me directly. The wisdom of that advice became clear the next evening when I came home to find Jake's truck parked outside my apartment building. He was sitting in the driver's seat, apparently waiting for me, and when he saw me pull into the parking lot, he got out and started walking toward my car. My first instinct was to drive away, but I realized that would just postpone the confrontation, not prevent it. Besides, I was tired of being afraid, tired of letting these people dictate where I could go and how I could live my life, so I parked and got out of my car, making sure to stay close enough to the building entrance that other residents would see us if anything happened. Jake looked terrible, like he hadn't slept or eaten properly in days. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair was greasy, and there was a desperate edge to his expression that I'd never seen before. When he started talking, his words came out in a rush, like he'd been practicing what he wanted to say but couldn't remember the order of his argument. He said I was ruining Melissa's life over nothing, that she'd never been in trouble with the law before and didn't deserve to have a criminal record because of one moment of poor judgment. He said she was devastated, that she couldn't eat or sleep because she was so worried about what would happen to her job and her reputation if the case went to trial. I listened without interrupting, curious to see if he'd eventually acknowledge what she'd actually done to me or express any concern for how I was handling the aftermath of being assaulted. But his entire focus was on Melissa's well-being, on how unfair it was that she had to face consequences for her actions, on how I was being vindictive and cruel by refusing to just forgive and forget. When he finally paused, I said calmly, "Jake, your girlfriend physically attacked me. She grabbed my hair and ripped it out in chunks. She left scratches on my neck that required medical treatment. If she's devastated about facing legal consequences for that, maybe she should have thought about that before she put her hands on me." Jake's expression darkened, and I could see the same entitlement that had allowed him to cheat on me for months, the same belief that his needs and wants should take precedence over everyone else's basic rights and dignity. He said I was being dramatic, that what Melissa had done wasn't that serious, that I was blowing it out of proportion because I was bitter about our breakup. The fact that he was still trying to minimize what had happened, still trying to make it my fault somehow, confirmed that I was dealing with people who would never take responsibility for their actions voluntarily. They would only change their behavior if they were forced to face meaningful consequences, and even then, they'd probably just learn to be more careful about getting caught rather than actually developing empathy or self-awareness. I told Jake I wasn't going to discuss the case with him, that if he or Melissa wanted to communicate with me, they needed to do it through their lawyer. Then I walked toward my building entrance, keys already in my hand, ready to get inside and away from him as quickly as possible. But Jake wasn't finished. He followed me to the door and said, "Rachel, please, just think about what you're doing. Melissa made a mistake, but she's not a bad person. She's just been under a lot of stress lately, and seeing you upset her more than she expected. She didn't mean to hurt you as badly as she did." Even his apology was self-serving, focused more on excusing Melissa's behavior than on acknowledging the impact it had had on me. He was asking me to consider her stress, her intentions, her feelings, but he hadn't once asked how I was doing or whether I felt safe or what it had been like for me to be attacked by someone I barely knew. I turned to face him one last time and said, "Jake, if Melissa didn't mean to hurt me, she wouldn't have grabbed my hair. If she was just stressed, she would have walked away instead of getting physical. And if you actually cared about my well-being, you would have stopped her instead of standing there watching it happen. The fact that you're here trying to convince me to drop charges instead of apologizing for what she did tells me everything I need to know about both of you." Jake's face flushed red, and for a moment I thought he might try to grab me the way he had in the parking lot at my work. But apparently he'd learned something from watching Melissa get arrested, because he just stood there clenching and unclenching his fists while I went inside and locked the door behind me. That night, I called Officer Martinez and reported Jake's visit. She said she'd make a note in the file and reminded me that if either of them contacted me again, I should call the police immediately rather than trying to handle it myself. She also mentioned that the district attorney had reviewed the case and decided to move forward with prosecution, which meant that regardless of what Jake and Melissa wanted, the state was now pursuing charges against her. Knowing that the decision was out of my hands was both a relief and a source of anxiety. I was glad that I wouldn't have to keep making the choice to pursue justice every time Jake showed up to pressure me into backing down. But I was also nervous about what it would mean to have my life examined in court, to have strangers judge whether I'd handled the situation appropriately, to have my private business become a matter of public record. Emma reminded me that I'd already done the hardest part by standing up for myself in the first place, by refusing to let Melissa's attack go unpunished, by building a case strong enough that the state was willing to prosecute. Everything else was just a matter of following through on decisions I'd already made, of staying committed to the path I'd chosen even when it felt overwhelming. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal meetings and paperwork and emotional preparation for what was to come. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Reeves who specialized in assault cases, walked me through what to expect at trial, how to handle cross-examination, what kinds of questions the defense might ask to try to undermine my credibility. Reeves was confident that we had a strong case, but she warned me that Melissa's defense would likely focus on portraying me as the aggressor, as someone who had provoked the attack through my words or behavior. She said they might try to argue that I'd been stalking Jake, that I'd been harassing Melissa, that I'd somehow forced her to defend herself physically. The thought of being painted as a stalker or a harasser was deeply disturbing, but Reeves assured me that the security footage would make it very difficult for the defense to sell that narrative convincingly. She said juries could see for themselves who had been calm and who had been aggressive, who had used words and who had used violence. As the trial date approached, I found myself oscillating between confidence and terror, between pride in my decision to fight back, and regret that I'd ever gotten involved with Jake in the first place. But underneath all the anxiety and uncertainty, there was something solid and unshakable, a core conviction that I was doing the right thing not just for myself but for anyone who might find themselves in a similar situation in the future. I thought about all the women who'd been told they were overreacting, who'd been pressured to forgive and forget, who'd been made to feel like their safety and dignity were less important than keeping the peace. I thought about how different my life might have been if I'd learned earlier to value myself enough to demand better treatment, to walk away from people who saw me as disposable,
to fight back when someone tried to diminish or harm me. The night before the trial was set to begin, I sat in my apartment looking through all the evidence we'd gathered, all the documentation of what had happened and how it had affected me. There were the medical records, the police reports, the security footage, the character references, the photographs of my injuries. Taken together, they told a story of someone who had been wronged and who had refused to accept that wrong as inevitable or deserved. Tomorrow, I would walk into that courtroom and tell my story to a jury of strangers. I would have to relive the humiliation and fear of being attacked, the helplessness of watching Jake stand by while another woman hurt me, the long process of rebuilding my sense of safety and self-worth. It would be difficult and emotional and exhausting, but I would also get to tell them about the strength I'd discovered in myself, about the support I'd found from family and friends who believed in my worth, about the justice system that had taken my case seriously and given me a chance to hold my attacker accountable. I would get to show them that being a victim didn't mean staying a victim, that being hurt didn't mean accepting defeat. Whatever happened in that courtroom, I knew I'd already won the most important battle. I'd chosen to fight for myself instead of disappearing quietly. I'd demanded justice instead of accepting injustice. I'd refused to let other people's cruelty define my worth or limit my possibilities. As I finally turned off the lights and tried to get some sleep, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not peace, exactly, but a deep satisfaction with the choices I'd made, a quiet pride in the woman I'd become through this process. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, I was exactly where I needed to be. The courthouse steps felt steeper than they'd looked from the parking lot, each one a deliberate choice to keep moving forward instead of turning around and pretending this day would never come. My heels clicked against the stone in a rhythm that sounded more confident than I felt, and I kept my shoulders straight, even though every instinct told me to hunch inward and make myself smaller. Emma walked beside me, her presence a steady anchor in what felt like a storm of nervous energy and suppressed anxiety. She'd taken the day off work without hesitation, had shown up at my apartment that morning with coffee and encouragement, and the kind of unwavering support that reminded me why family mattered more than romantic relationships ever could. Ms. Reeves met us in the courthouse lobby, her briefcase in one hand and a manila folder thick with evidence in the other. She looked every inch the competent professional in her navy suit and sensible heels, and when she smiled at me, I could see the confidence that had made me choose her to represent my interests in this whole mess. She walked us through the day's schedule one more time, explaining how jury selection would work, what kinds of questions the attorneys might ask potential jurors, how long the whole process was likely to take. Her voice was calm and measured, the tone of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before, and I tried to absorb some of that professional composure even though my stomach was twisting itself into knots. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, more like a large conference room than the dramatic spaces I'd seen in movies and television shows. The walls were painted an institutional beige that was probably supposed to be soothing but mostly just looked bland, and the fluorescent lighting cast everything in a harsh, unflattering glow that made everyone look slightly unwell. Melissa was already seated at the defendant's table with her attorney, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, who looked like he specialized in making assault charges disappear. She was wearing a conservative dress and minimal makeup, clearly trying to project an image of respectability and innocence that bore no resemblance to the woman who'd grabbed my hair and tried to use it to slam my head into the pavement. When she turned to look at me, I expected to see some trace of remorse or acknowledgement of what she'd done. Instead, her expression was cold and calculating, like she was sizing up an opponent before a business negotiation. There was no shame in her eyes, no recognition that she was sitting in that courtroom because she'd chosen to assault someone over a verbal disagreement. Jake was sitting in the gallery behind her, presumably there to provide moral support and character testimony if needed. He looked uncomfortable in his dress shirt and tie, like he was wearing a costume that didn't quite fit, and when our eyes met briefly, he had the decency to look away. At least he seemed to understand that his presence was an additional insult, even if he wasn't willing to stay home. The jury selection process took most of the morning, with attorneys on both sides asking potential jurors about their experiences with domestic violence, their opinions about assault cases, their ability to remain impartial when evaluating evidence involving interpersonal conflicts. Ms. Reeves was methodical in her questioning, weeding out anyone who seemed inclined to blame victims or minimize the seriousness of physical violence. Melissa's attorney, Mr. Davidson, focused on finding jurors who might be sympathetic to his client's position, people who understood that emotions could run high in romantic situations, that sometimes good people made poor choices under stress. I watched him work and felt a chill of recognition, understanding that he was already laying the groundwork for the defense strategy Miss Reeves had warned me about. By the time we broke for lunch, 12 jurors and 2 alternates had been seated. They looked like a representative cross-section of the community, men and women of various ages and backgrounds, people who would presumably be able to evaluate the evidence objectively and reach a fair verdict. Miss Reeves seemed satisfied with the composition, though she reminded me that juries were always unpredictable, that even the strongest case could be undermined by factors beyond anyone's control. We ate lunch at a small cafe across the street from the courthouse, but I could barely taste the sandwich Emma had ordered for me. My mind kept racing through everything that was about to happen, all the ways the defense might try to twist my words or reframe my actions, all the intimate details of my relationship with Jake that would become public record by the end of the day. Miss Reeves used the time to go over my testimony one final time, reminding me to stick to the facts, to answer only the questions being asked, to stay calm even if Mr. Davidson tried to rattle me during cross-examination. She said the most important thing was to tell the truth as clearly and completely as possible, to trust that the jury would be able to distinguish between someone who was genuinely wronged and someone who was trying to manipulate the system for personal gain. When we returned to the courtroom for opening statements, I could feel the energy shift from procedural to adversarial. This was where the real battle would be fought, where 2 competing narratives about what had happened in that parking lot would be presented to 12 strangers who would ultimately decide whether Melissa faced consequences for her actions. Reeves spoke first, outlining the prosecution's case in clear, straightforward language that emphasized the facts over emotional appeals. She described the security footage that showed Melissa grabbing my hair unprovoked, the medical evidence documenting my injuries, the testimony of witnesses who would confirm the timeline of events. She painted a picture of a woman who had used physical violence to silence someone whose words she didn't want to hear, someone who had escalated a verbal disagreement into a criminal assault. Her presentation was methodical and compelling, but I found myself holding my breath as Mr. Davidson rose to deliver his opening statement. This was where I'd learn exactly how he planned to defend the indefensible, how he intended to convince a jury that grabbing someone's hair and ripping it out was somehow justified or excusable. Mr. Davidson's approach was more sophisticated than I'd expected. He didn't try to deny that Melissa had grabbed my hair, but he framed it as a momentary lapse in judgment by a woman who was being harassed and threatened by her boyfriend's unstable ex-girlfriend. He described me as someone who had been stalking Jake, who had refused to accept that their relationship was over, who had confronted Melissa repeatedly and aggressively until she felt she had no choice but to defend herself. According to his version of events, I was the real aggressor, someone who had used psychological manipulation and emotional blackmail to torment an innocent woman who was just trying to build a life with the man she loved. Melissa's hair pulling was presented as a desperate attempt at self-defense by someone who felt cornered and threatened, a regrettable but understandable response to months of harassment and intimidation. Listening to him speak, I felt like I was hearing about someone else's life, someone whose actions and motivations bore no resemblance to my own. The woman he described was vindictive and manipulative, someone who would use the legal system as a weapon against people who had rejected her. It was a masterful piece of fiction, and I could see some of the jurors nodding along as he painted me as the villain in this story. Ms. Reeves had warned me that this would happen, that defense attorneys often tried to put the victim on trial instead of focusing on the defendant's action. But hearing it actually happen, sitting there while a stranger told a room full of people that I was a stalker and a harasser, was more devastating than I'd anticipated. When Mr. Davidson finished his opening statement, I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. The confident, righteous anger that had sustained me through months of preparation suddenly felt naive and misplaced. Maybe I really was making too big a deal out of what had happened. Maybe I really was using the legal system to get revenge on people who had hurt my feelings. Emma must have sensed my wavering resolve because she reached over and squeezed my hand, leaning close to whisper that everything Mr. Davidson had said was lies designed to confuse the jury, that the evidence would speak for itself regardless of what stories the defense tried to tell.
Ms. Reeves caught my eye and nodded slightly. A reminder that we'd prepared for this, that the truth would emerge once the actual testimony began. The prosecution's first witness was Officer Martinez, who testified about responding to my initial complaint and conducting the investigation that had led to charges being filed. She described the evidence she'd collected, the interviews she'd conducted, the security footage that clearly showed what had happened in the parking lot outside my workplace. Under Reeves's questioning, Officer Martinez was professional and thorough, walking the jury through each step of the investigation while emphasizing that all the evidence pointed to an unprovoked assault by the defendant. She explained that she'd found no evidence of stalking or harassment by me, no indication that I'd done anything to justify or provoke Melissa's violent response. Miss Davidson's cross-examination focused on trying to establish that the police investigation had been incomplete, that Officer Martinez hadn't thoroughly explored the possibility that I might have been the real aggressor in the situation. He suggested that she'd been biased in my favor from the beginning, that she'd failed to investigate credible allegations that I'd been harassing his client for months. But Officer Martinez held her ground, calmly explaining that she'd followed standard procedures, that she'd evaluated all available evidence objectively, that the case against Melissa was based on facts rather than assumptions or personal bias. She pointed out that if there had been credible evidence of harassment or stalking by me, those charges would have been filed as well. The next witness was Dr. Chen, the physician who had examined me after the assault. She testified about the injuries she'd documented, showing the jury photographs of the scratch marks on my neck and the bald patches where Melissa had ripped out chunks of my hair. Her testimony was clinical and factual, but the visual evidence was powerful, making it impossible for anyone to pretend that what had happened was minor or insignificant. Davidson tried to minimize the severity of my injuries during cross-examination, suggesting that they were superficial and would heal completely within a few days. But Dr. Chen pushed back, explaining that hair-pulling assaults often caused more psychological trauma than physical damage, that the visible injuries were just one aspect of the harm that had been done. She also testified about the potential for more serious injuries in cases like this, describing how easily hair-pulling could escalate to head trauma or neck injuries if the victim fell or was slammed into a hard surface. Her expert opinion gave weight to the prosecution's argument that Melissa's actions had been dangerous as well as illegal, that the outcome could have been much worse if circumstances had been slightly different. The security guard from my workplace, Frank, testified next about retrieving and preserving the footage that had captured the entire incident. He described the camera system, the chain of custody for the evidence, the technical specifications that proved the video was authentic and unedited. His testimony was dry and procedural, but it established the foundation for what everyone knew would be the most important piece of evidence in the case. When Ms. Reeves announced that the prosecution's next exhibit would be the security footage, I felt my heart rate spike dramatically. I'd seen the video dozens of times during preparation, but watching it again in front of a jury felt like reliving the assault all over again. The courtroom went completely silent as the large monitor was wheeled into position and the bailiff dimmed the light. The footage was even more damning than I'd remembered. The camera angle captured everything clearly, from Jake grabbing my arm to prevent me from leaving to Melissa's sudden lunge forward to grab my hair. You could see the force she used, the way my feet left the ground when she yanked upward, the way she held on even as I tried to break free from her grip. What struck me most was how obvious it was that I hadn't done anything to provoke or deserve what happened to me. I was clearly trying to walk away from the situation when Melissa attacked, clearly attempting to disengage rather than escalate the conflict. There was no ambiguity in the footage, no room for interpretation or alternative explanation. I watched the jurors' faces as the video played, and I could see several of them wince when Melissa grabbed my hair, saw others shake their heads slightly when she continued to hold on even after I was obviously in pain. The defense's narrative about me being the aggressor was impossible to maintain in the face of such clear visual evidence. Davidson objected several times during the presentation of the video, arguing that it was prejudicial and inflammatory, that it would unfairly influence the jury against his client. But the judge overruled each objection, pointing out that the footage was directly relevant to the charges and that its probative value outweighed any potential for unfair prejudice. When the lights came back up, the mood in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. The jurors looked somber and thoughtful, and several of them glanced at Melissa with expressions that ranged from disapproval to outright disgust. Mr. Davidson's opening statement suddenly seemed less persuasive, his client's actions less defensible. The prosecution's final witness was Frank, my former neighbor, who had known both Jake and me during the time we were dating. He testified about Jake's controlling behavior, about arguments he'd overheard, about his observations that I seemed to become more isolated and anxious as the relationship progressed. Under Reeves' questioning, Frank painted a picture of a woman who had been gradually worn down by an unhealthy relationship, someone who had finally found the courage to leave, but was being punished for that decision by her ex-boyfriend and his new girlfriend. His testimony provided important context for understanding how the assault had occurred, showing that it wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of intimidation and control. Mr. Davidson's cross-examination of Frank was more aggressive than his questioning of the previous witnesses. He tried to establish that Frank was biased in my favor, that his observations were filtered through personal dislike of Jake, that he was exaggerating or misremembering events to make me look more sympathetic. But Frank was unshakable in his testimony, calmly insisting that he'd simply reported what he'd seen and heard, that his only interest was in telling the truth about the situation. He pointed out that he'd never discussed my relationship problems with me directly, that his observations were based on objective evidence rather than personal conversations or hearsay. When Ms. Reeves announced that the prosecution was ready to call its final witness, I felt a surge of terror so intense that I thought I might actually pass out. This was the moment I'd been dreading for months. The moment when I'd have to sit in front of a room full of strangers and tell them about the most humiliating experience of my life. Walking to the witness stand felt like moving through water, each step requiring enormous effort and concentration. The court reporter positioned her hands over her keyboard. The jury members leaned forward slightly in their seats, and I could feel every eye in the room focused on me with laser intensity. Miss Reeves began with basic questions designed to help me relax and establish my credibility. She asked about my education, my job, my living situation, painting a picture of someone who was stable and responsible, someone whose word could be trusted. Then she moved into the background of my relationship with Jake, how we'd met, how long we'd been together, how and why it had ended. Telling that part of the story was easier than I'd expected. Maybe because I'd had so much practice explaining it to police officers and lawyers and family members. I described Jake's increasing distance, my growing suspicion that something was wrong, the conversation with Melissa at the coffee shop that had finally revealed the truth about what was happening. Reeves guided me through the timeline carefully, making sure the jury understood that I'd tried to handle the situation maturely, that I'd ended the relationship cleanly and attempted to move on with my life. She established that I hadn't contacted Jake or Melissa after learning about their affair, hadn't attempted to interfere with their relationship, hadn't done anything that could reasonably be construed as harassment or stalking. When we reached the events of the day of the assault, Reeves slowed down significantly, asking me to describe in detail what had happened in the parking lot outside my workplace. I told the jury about Jake waiting for me, about his attempts to convince me to give him another chance, about Melissa's sudden appearance and aggressive behavior. Describing the moment when Melissa grabbed my hair was one of the hardest things I'd ever had to do. I could feel my voice starting to shake as I explained how shocked I'd been, how much it had hurt, how helpless I'd felt while she used my hair to jerk me around like a rag doll. Several jurors were visibly uncomfortable as I testified, and I could see sympathy in their expressions. Miss Reeves asked me to describe my injuries, both physical and emotional, and I told the jury about the pain in my scalp, the humiliation of having chunks of hair ripped out, the ongoing anxiety about running into Melissa again. I explained how the assault had affected my sense of safety, my ability to trust other people, my confidence in navigating conflict situations. When Miss Reeves finished her direct examination, I felt drained but relieved that the worst was over. I'd told my story clearly and completely, had answered every question honestly, had given the jury all the information they needed to understand what had really happened in that parking lot. But then Mr. Davidson stood up for cross-examination, and I realized that the real test was just beginning. This was where he would try to tear apart everything I'd just said, where he would attempt to transform me from a victim into a villain, through careful questioning and strategic manipulation. Davidson's approach was subtle at first, asking seemingly innocent questions about my relationship with Jake that were designed to make me look possessive and controlling. He wanted to know if I'd ever checked his phone, if I'd questioned him about where he was going or who he was seeing, if I'd made demands about how he spent his time. I answered each question honestly, explaining that I'd occasionally asked about his plans because I wanted to spend time with him, that I'd expressed concern when he became distant and secretive, that I'd tried to communicate about problems in our relationship rather than ignoring them. But Miss Davidson had a way of framing my responses that made normal relationship behavior sound obsessive and intrusive. He asked about the night I'd discovered Jake's affair, suggesting that I'd somehow forced Melissa to reveal the truth, that I'd been aggressive and confrontational in demanding information I had no right to possess. I tried to explain that Melissa had volunteered the information, that she'd seemed to enjoy telling me about the affair, but Mr. Davidson kept interrupting and redirecting my answers. The questioning became more pointed when we reached the events of the assault. Miss Davidson suggested that I'd deliberately provoked Melissa, that I'd said things designed to make her angry, that I'd been trying to humiliate her in front of Jake. He painted a picture of someone who had been looking for a fight, someone who had gotten exactly what she'd been asking for. I felt my composure starting to crack under the relentless pressure of his questions. Every answer I gave seemed to be twisted into evidence of my guilt. Every attempt to defend myself was framed as further proof that I was manipulative and dishonest. I could see some of the jurors starting to look at me differently, their earlier sympathy replaced by skepticism and doubt. Miss Reeves objected several times when Mr. Davidson's questions became argumentative or called for speculation, but the damage was being done. He was succeeding in his goal of making me look like an unreliable narrator, someone whose version of events couldn't be trusted because I had too much invested in portraying myself as a victim. The breaking point came when Miss Davidson asked if I'd filed the assault charges out of a genuine desire for justice, or as a way to get revenge on the woman who had stolen my boyfriend. The question was so loaded, so designed to make me look petty and vindictive, that I felt tears start to form in my eyes. I took a deep breath and looked directly at the jury as I answered, speaking slowly and clearly despite the emotion in my voice. I said that I'd filed charges because no one had the right to put their hands on me, regardless of what words had been exchanged, regardless of what personal conflicts existed between us. I said that if we lived in a society where people could assault others without consequences, then none of us were safe. Mr. Davidson tried to follow up with additional questions, but Miss Reeves objected, and the judge sustained the objection. When Davidson finally announced that he had no further questions, I felt like I'd been through a battle, bruised and bloodied, but still standing. Miss Reeves had a brief redirect examination, giving me a chance to clarify some of the points that Mr. Davidson had tried to confuse. She asked me directly if I'd ever threatened Melissa, if I'd ever attempted to contact her outside of the incidents I'd already described, if I'd done anything that could reasonably be interpreted as harassment or stalking. My answers were clear and unequivocal. No, no. When I finally stepped down from the witness stand, my legs were shaking so badly that I could barely walk back to my seat. Emma reached over and squeezed my hand, whispering that I'd done great, that I'd told the truth clearly and convincingly despite Mr. Davidson's attempts to confuse. The defense portion of the trial began immediately after lunch, with Mr. Davidson calling Jake as his first witness. I watched my ex-boyfriend walk to the witness stand, still looking uncomfortable in his formal clothes, still avoiding eye contact with me even though we were sitting just a few feet apart. Jake's testimony was a masterclass in selective memory and convenient interpretation. According to his version of events, I'd been increasingly possessive and demanding throughout our relationship, constantly questioning his movements and friendships, making unreasonable demands on his time and attention. He described me as someone who couldn't accept that our relationship was over, who had been harassing both him and Melissa for months. He painted Melissa as a victim of my obsessive behavior, someone who had tried to be understanding and patient, but had finally reached her breaking point,
when I confronted her in the parking lot. According to Jake, my words that day had been so threatening and aggressive that Melissa had felt she had no choice but to defend herself physically. Listening to Jake testify was surreal, like hearing about my own life from the perspective of someone who had never actually met me. The woman he described bore no resemblance to the person I knew myself to be, no connection to the memories I had of our relationship or the events that had led to its end. Miss Reeves' cross-examination of Jake was brutal and precise. She forced him to admit that he'd never filed any harassment complaints against me, never contacted police about my alleged stalking behavior, never taken any of the steps that someone genuinely afraid for their safety would normally take. She made him acknowledge that the security footage showed no evidence of threatening behavior by me, that my words and actions had been consistently defensive, rather than aggressive. Most damaging to Jake's credibility was Ms. Reeves' exploration of his relationship timeline. She forced him to admit that he'd been seeing Melissa for months, while still claiming to be committed to me, that he'd lied repeatedly about his whereabouts and activities, that he'd never given me a clear explanation for why our relationship was deteriorating. By the time Ms. Reeves finished with him, Jake looked like exactly what he was, a cheater and a liar whose testimony couldn't be trusted because he'd already proven himself willing to deceive the people closest to him. Several jurors were looking at him with obvious distaste, and his credibility as a witness had been thoroughly destroyed. Melissa took the stand next, and I was curious to see how she would try to justify her actions. She was composed and articulate, sticking closely to the narrative that Ms. Davidson had outlined in his opening statement. According to her testimony, I'd been harassing her for months, showing up at places where she worked and socialized, making threatening phone calls and sending intimidating messages. She described the parking lot incident as the culmination of months of escalating harassment, claiming that I'd cornered her and Jake, that I'd made threatening statements about what I was going to do to her, that she'd grabbed my hair only as a last resort when she felt physically threatened and unable to escape. Her testimony was polished and convincing, delivered with just the right amount of emotion to seem genuine without appearing overdramatic. If I hadn't lived through the actual events, I might have found her version of the story believable. She came across as someone who was reluctant to be there, someone who wished the whole situation could have been avoided, but was forced to defend herself against baseless accusations. But Reeves was ready for her, armed with evidence that systematically dismantled every lie Melissa had told. She started by asking Melissa to provide specific dates and times for the alleged harassment, to name witnesses who had seen me stalking her, to produce copies of the threatening messages I'd supposedly sent. When Melissa couldn't provide any of these details, claiming that she'd been too frightened to document everything properly, Ms. Reeves moved on to the security footage. She forced Melissa to watch the video of the assault, asking her to point out where in the footage I had threatened her, where I had acted aggressively, where I had done anything that could justify her violent response. Melissa's composure began to crack under the pressure of Reeves' questioning. She became defensive and evasive, claiming that the camera angle didn't show everything, that there had been verbal threats that weren't captured on audio, that the context of the situation couldn't be understood without knowing about the months of harassment that had preceded it. But Reeves was relentless, pointing out that Melissa had never filed any police reports about this alleged harassment, never sought a restraining order, never contacted my employer or apartment management to complain about my behavior. She made it clear that a reasonable person who was genuinely being stalked would have taken at least some of these steps to protect themselves. The most damaging moment came when Ms. Reeves asked Melissa about her demeanor immediately after the assault. She pointed out that someone who had just been forced to defend themselves against a genuine threat would likely be shaken and upset, not calm and satisfied as Melissa had appeared in the footage. Ms. Reeves asked Melissa to explain why she hadn't immediately called police, if she genuinely believed I was a threat to her safety, why she hadn't sought medical attention if she genuinely feared for her well-being, why she'd seemed to be enjoying the confrontation rather than trying to escape from it. By the time Ms. Reeves finished her cross-examination, Melissa's carefully constructed facade had completely collapsed. She looked angry and frustrated, no longer the sympathetic victim she'd tried to portray herself as. Her story had been exposed as a collection of lies and convenient excuses, and her credibility had been destroyed as thoroughly as Jane. The defense rested without calling any additional witnesses, apparently recognizing that their case had been fatally weakened by the cross-examinations of their key witnesses. Mr. Davidson's closing argument was a last-ditch attempt to salvage something from the wreckage, but he was clearly working with damaged material. He tried to refocus the jury's attention on the emotional context of the situation, arguing that Melissa had been under enormous stress and had simply reacted badly to a difficult situation. He suggested that criminal charges were too harsh a punishment for what was essentially a momentary lapse in judgment, that a civil resolution would be more appropriate for this type of interpersonal conflict. But Ms. Reeves' closing argument was devastating in its simplicity and power. She reminded the jury that the law was clear: no one had the right to assault another person, regardless of what words had been spoken, regardless of what emotional conflicts existed between them. She pointed out that the security footage showed an unprovoked attack by the defendant against someone who was trying to walk away from the situation. She emphasized that Melissa had made a choice when she grabbed my hair, that she'd escalated a verbal disagreement into physical violence, that she'd caused actual bodily harm to someone who had done nothing more than refuse to be intimidated. She reminded the jury that allowing people to use violence as a response to words they didn't like would make all of society less safe. When both sides had finished their closing arguments, the judge gave the jury their instructions and sent them off to deliberate. Ms. Reeves warned me that jury deliberations were unpredictable, that even the strongest cases could result in unexpected verdicts, that I should prepare myself for any outcome. The waiting was agony. Emma and I sat in the courthouse cafe drinking coffee and trying to make small talk while my mind raced through every possible scenario. I kept second-guessing my decision to press charges, wondering if I should have just let the whole thing go, worrying that the jury might have been swayed by Mr. Davidson's attempts to paint me as a vindictive ex-girlfriend. But every time I started to regret my choices, I reminded myself of why I'd started this process in the first place.
Melissa had assaulted me, had caused me physical harm, had tried to intimidate me into silence. If I let her get away with that, if I allowed the defense's narrative to go unchallenged, then I'd be sending a message that my safety and dignity didn't matter. After 3 hours of deliberation, the jury sent word that they'd reached a verdict. Walking back into that courtroom was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether months of legal preparation had been worth it, whether justice would actually be served. The jury foreman stood to read the verdict, and I held my breath as he announced that they'd found Melissa guilty of assault. The wave of relief that washed over me was so intense that I almost collapsed in my chair. It was over. She'd been held accountable. The system had worked. Melissa's reaction was immediate and dramatic. She started crying and shaking her head, apparently unable to believe that a jury had actually convicted her of a crime. Jake looked stunned, like he'd genuinely expected his girlfriend to be acquitted despite all the evidence against her. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following month, explaining that a pre-sentence investigation would need to be completed before she could determine an appropriate punishment. Reeves warned me that Melissa would likely receive probation and community service rather than jail time, but that the important thing was that she now had a criminal record that would follow her for the rest of her life. As we left the courthouse that day, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and vindication. The legal process had been brutal and emotionally draining, but it had also been empowering in ways I hadn't expected. I'd stood up for myself, demanded justice, and refused to let other people's cruelty go unpunished. Emma was beaming with pride, telling everyone who would listen that her sister had just won a major victory against someone who had tried to intimidate and silence her. Ms. Reeves was satisfied with the outcome, explaining that assault convictions in cases like this sent an important message that physical violence was never an acceptable response to interpersonal conflict. That night, I sat in my apartment, looking at the local news coverage of the trial, reading about how a jury had convicted a woman of assaulting her boyfriend's ex-girlfriend in a workplace parking lot. Seeing my story reduced to a few paragraphs in a newspaper was strange, but it was also validating to see it described in objective terms that made it clear who had been in the wrong. I thought about calling my parents to tell them about the verdict, but I realized I didn't need their validation anymore. I'd proven to myself that I was strong enough to fight for what was right, brave enough to stand up to people who tried to hurt me, resilient enough to survive whatever consequences came from demanding justice. The woman who had sat in her car months earlier, staring at clumps of her own hair and feeling completely powerless, was gone. In her place was someone who understood her own worth, who refused to accept mistreatment as inevitable, who knew that sometimes the only way to stop bullies was to fight back with everything you had. Melissa would face sentencing in a few weeks, and there would probably be appeals and motions and other legal complications. But the hard part was over. She'd been convicted, her version of events had been rejected by a jury, and the official record would forever show that she was the aggressor in our conflict. More importantly, I'd learned something about myself that no one could ever take away. I was stronger than I'd thought, braver than I'd believed, more capable of standing up for myself than I'd ever imagined. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew I could face them with confidence and dignity, secure in the knowledge that I deserved better treatment than I'd been accepting for far too long. The weeks following the verdict passed in a strange haze of normalcy punctuated by moments of surreal reflection. I'd return to work each morning, sit through meetings about marketing campaigns and client presentations, respond to emails about quarterly projections, and occasionally catch myself marveling that life could feel so ordinary after something so extraordinary had happened. My colleagues at Henderson Marketing had been supportive throughout the trial, with Patricia even offering me additional time off if I needed it to recover from the stress of testifying. But I discovered that staying busy was better than dwelling on everything that had transpired, that focusing on concrete tasks helped keep my mind from replaying courtroom scenes, or wondering what Melissa and Jake were doing with their newfound reality. The physical evidence of the assault had mostly healed by then. My hair had grown back enough to cover the bald spots, though I still found myself unconsciously touching those areas when I was nervous or distracted. The scratch marks on my neck had faded to thin white lines that were barely visible, unless you knew to look for them. But the internal changes felt permanent, etched into my sense of self in ways that would probably never completely disappear. I'd started seeing a therapist, Dr. Sarah Williams, partly because Miss Reeves had suggested it might be helpful for processing the trauma of both the assault and the legal proceedings, but mostly because I wanted to understand how I'd ended up in such a toxic situation in the first place. I was determined not to repeat the patterns that had made me vulnerable to someone like Jake, not to mistake manipulation for love or control for caring ever again. Dr. Williams was a soft-spoken woman in her 50s, who specialized in helping people recover from interpersonal violence and relationship trauma. During our sessions, she helped me trace the threads that had led from my childhood need to please everyone to my adult willingness to accept less than I deserved from romantic partners. We talked about how growing up as the older sister in a family where keeping peace was valued above individual needs had taught me to prioritize other people's comfort over my own well-being. We explored how my father's emotional distance and my mother's anxiety had created a template where love felt conditional, something that had to be earned through constant effort and self-sacrifice. Most importantly, Dr. Williams helped me understand that what had happened with Jake wasn't a reflection of my worth or lovability, but rather evidence of his inability to maintain healthy relationships. She taught me to recognize the difference between someone who was genuinely struggling with their own issues and someone who was deliberately using those issues to manipulate and control others. These conversations were painful but necessary, like surgery that hurts in the moment but leads to better long-term health. I was learning to identify the warning signs I'd missed with Jake, the subtle ways he'd undermined my confidence and isolated me from my support system, the gradual erosion of boundaries that had left me feeling grateful for basic courtesy and respect. Emma had become my closest confidant throughout this process, checking in regularly and celebrating each small milestone in my recovery. She'd been there when I'd finally worked up the courage to delete all the photos of Jake from my phone, when I'd boxed up the few belongings he'd left at my apartment and donated them to charity, when I'd changed my phone number to avoid any possibility of unwanted contact. She was also there the evening I received an unexpected phone call from Ms. Reeves, about 3 weeks after the trial had ended. I was making dinner in my kitchen when my phone rang, and seeing the lawyer's name on the screen immediately sent my heart racing with anxiety about what new development might require my attention. Reeves's voice was carefully neutral when she told me that Melissa's attorney had reached out about the possibility of a plea agreement for the sentencing phase. Apparently, Melissa was hoping to avoid jail time by accepting responsibility for her actions and agreeing to certain conditions like anger management classes and community service. The idea that Melissa might escape prison entirely was disappointing but not surprising. Reeves had warned me from the beginning that first-time assault convictions rarely resulted in significant jail time, especially when the defendant had no prior criminal history and the victim's injuries weren't life-threatening. The important victory had been the conviction itself, the official acknowledgement that what she'd done was criminal and unacceptable. But what Miss Reeves told me next was more interesting. As part of the proposed plea agreement, Melissa would be required to stay away from me completely, with any violation resulting in additional criminal charges. She'd also have to write a formal letter of apology acknowledging what she'd done and accepting full responsibility for her action. The idea of receiving an apology from Melissa felt both satisfying and pointless. I wanted her to understand the impact of what she'd done, to recognize that her actions had been wrong and harmful, but I also knew that any apology delivered as part of a legal requirement would be essentially meaningless. She'd say whatever words were necessary to minimize her punishment, regardless of whether she actually felt remorse. Ms. Reeves asked if I had any objections to the proposed plea agreement, explaining that as the victim, my input would be considered by the judge during sentencing. I told her I didn't oppose the deal as long as the restraining order provisions were strong and enforceable, but that I wanted to submit a victim impact statement to make sure the court understood the full scope of how the assault had affected my life. Writing that statement turned out to be one of the most cathartic experiences of the entire legal process. For months I'd been focused on building a case, gathering evidence, preparing testimony, responding to defense strategy. But the victim impact statement was my opportunity to speak directly about my own experience without worrying about legal strategy or courtroom tactics. I wrote about the immediate physical pain of having my hair ripped out, but also about the longer-lasting psychological impact of being attacked for speaking my mind. I described how the assault had made me question my own judgment, wonder if I'd somehow provoked or deserved what happened, doubt my ability to recognize potentially dangerous situations. I wrote about the humiliation of being physically overpowered by someone I barely knew, the violation of having my personal space invaded in such a violent way, the fear that had lingered for weeks afterward whenever I encountered strangers or found myself in isolated locations. I explained how the assault had affected my work performance, my relationships with friends and family, my overall sense of safety and security in the world. But I also wrote about the strength I'd discovered in myself throughout this process, the realization that I was capable of fighting back when threatened, the satisfaction of seeing justice served through the legal system. I wanted the court to understand that while Melissa's actions had caused real harm, they'd also revealed reserves of courage and resilience I hadn't known I possessed. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in early October, almost exactly 6 months after the assault had occurred. I debated whether to attend, since the plea agreement meant there wouldn't be any surprises about the outcome, but ultimately decided that I wanted to see the process through to its conclusion. Emma offered to come with me again, but I chose to go alone this time. This felt like something I needed to do by myself, a final step in reclaiming my autonomy and demonstrating that I no longer needed protection or support to face difficult situations. I was nervous but not afraid, uncertain about what I might feel but confident in my ability to handle whatever emotions arose. The same courtroom that had hosted the trial looked different on sentencing day, less formal and adversarial, more like a place where administrative business was conducted. There were fewer people in the gallery, just a handful of court personnel and observers with no apparent connection to our case. Melissa sat at the defendant's table with Mr. Davidson, wearing another conservative dress that was clearly chosen to project remorse and respectability. She looked smaller than I remembered, less commanding and confident than she'd been during her testimony, more like someone who was finally beginning to understand the seriousness of her situation. Jake was notably absent from the courtroom, a fact that I found both surprising and revealing. Either he'd finally realized that his continued presence was inappropriate, or he'd decided that supporting Melissa through her sentencing wasn't worth the time and effort. Either way, his absence felt like a small victory, evidence that the consequences of their actions were beginning to drive a wedge between them. Judge Morrison called the case to order and asked if the parties were ready to proceed with sentencing under the terms of the proposed plea agreement. Mr. Davidson confirmed that his client was prepared to accept responsibility for her actions and comply with all the conditions that had been negotiated with the prosecution. Ms. Reeves presented the state's sentencing recommendation, explaining that while the assault had caused real harm to the victim, Melissa's lack of prior criminal history and willingness to accept responsibility supported a sentence focused on rehabilitation rather than punishment. She recommended 12 months of probation, 100 hours of community service, mandatory anger management counseling, and a permanent restraining order protecting me from any future contact. Mr. Davidson spoke next, emphasizing his client's remorse and her commitment to learning from this experience. He painted a picture of someone who had made a serious mistake under emotional stress, someone who was already taking steps to address the underlying issues that had led to her poor judgment. He asked the court to consider Melissa's previously clean record and her potential for rehabilitation. When Judge Morrison asked if the defendant wanted to make a statement before sentencing, Melissa stood and read from a prepared text. Her words were carefully crafted and appropriately remorseful, acknowledging that she'd acted inappropriately and expressing regret for the harm she'd caused. She promised to complete whatever requirements the court imposed and to stay away from me completely. But listening to her speak, I could hear the same calculated quality that had characterized her testimony during the trial. She was saying the right words in the right order, but there was no genuine emotion behind them, no real understanding of why her actions had been wrong beyond the fact that they'd resulted in legal consequences for her. When Judge Morrison asked if I wanted to make a statement, I stood and approached the podium with the victim impact statement I'd spent weeks perfecting. Reading it aloud in that courtroom, with Melissa forced to listen to every word, felt like the culmination of months of finding my voice and learning to advocate for myself. I spoke about the physical and emotional impact of the assault, but I also talked about the broader implications of allowing people to use violence as a response to words they didn't like. I reminded the court that assault cases weren't just about the individuals involved, but about the kind of society we wanted to live in, the standards of behavior we were willing to tolerate from each other. Most importantly, I talked about the journey from victimhood to empowerment, from feeling helpless and afraid to recognizing my own strength and worth. I wanted anyone who might face a similar situation to understand that fighting back was possible, that seeking justice was worthwhile, that refusing to accept mistreatment was not only appropriate but necessary. When I finished reading and returned to my seat, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with Melissa's eventual sentence. I'd used the legal system to hold someone accountable for harming me, and I'd found my own voice in the process. Regardless of what punishment the court imposed, I'd already achieved the most important victory by refusing to let the assault go unaddressed. Judge Morrison sentenced Melissa to the terms of the plea agreement, 12 months of supervised probation, 120 hours of community service, mandatory participation in an anger management program, and a 5-year restraining order that prohibited any contact with me. She also imposed court costs and restitution for my medical expenses, though the financial amounts were minimal compared to the symbolic importance of the judgment. As the hearing concluded and court officials processed the paperwork, I watched Melissa sign document after document, each one a formal acknowledgement of her guilt and her obligations to the legal system. She looked tired and defeated, like someone who was finally understanding that actions have consequences, that adult behavior is subject to adult accountability. When I left the courthouse that day, I felt lighter than I had in months. The legal process was finally over, the chapter was officially closed, and I could move forward without wondering what would happen next or whether justice would be served. Melissa would serve her sentence, complete her requirements, and hopefully learn something about appropriate behavior in the process. More importantly,
I'd proven to myself that I was capable of navigating complex challenges, standing up to people who tried to intimidate me, and using the systems available to protect myself and others. The scared, confused woman who had sat in her car staring at clumps of her own hair was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and knew how to fight for it. The restraining order meant that I could go about my daily life without worrying about unexpected encounters with Melissa or Jake. I could attend work events, social gatherings, and public functions without constantly scanning the crowd for familiar faces or planning escape routes in case of confrontation. The legal protection provided a sense of security that allowed me to focus on rebuilding and moving forward rather than staying perpetually defensive. 6 months later, I was promoted to senior account manager at Henderson Marketing, a position that came with significantly more responsibility and a salary increase that allowed me to move to a better apartment in a safer neighborhood. Patricia told me that my handling of the difficult situation with Jake and Melissa had demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership and resilience the company valued in its senior staff. I also started dating again, cautiously at first, but with a much clearer understanding of what I wanted and needed from a romantic partner. The lessons I'd learned about recognizing manipulation and maintaining boundaries made me better equipped to identify genuinely kind and respectful people, to distinguish between someone who was supportive and someone who was simply trying to control me in more subtle ways. Eventually, I met David through a mutual friend at a work event. He was nothing like Jake, steady and consistent rather than dramatic and unpredictable, supportive of my career ambitions rather than threatened by them, interested in building a partnership based on mutual respect rather than trying to change me into someone more convenient for him to manage. Our relationship developed slowly, built on friendship and genuine compatibility rather than the intense chemistry and emotional drama that had characterized my connection with Jake. David never tried to isolate me from my friends and family, never criticized my choices or made me feel like I had to earn his attention and affection through constant accommodation. 2 years after the sentencing, I ran into a former colleague of Jake's at a coffee shop downtown. She mentioned, almost in passing, that Jake and Melissa had broken up several months earlier, apparently in a dramatic confrontation that had involved accusations of infidelity and financial impropriety. According to this acquaintance, Melissa had discovered that Jake had been seeing other women throughout their relationship, just as he'd done with me. Learning about their breakup gave me a strange sense of vindication mixed with pity. I was glad to know that my suspicions about Jake's character had been accurate, that the problems in our relationship hadn't been unique or personal, that his behavior toward me was part of a larger pattern of deception and manipulation. But I also felt sorry for Melissa. Despite everything she'd done to me, she'd thought she was winning when she stole Jake from me, thought she was getting something valuable that I'd been too inadequate to keep. Instead, she'd gotten exactly what I'd escaped from. The irony wasn't lost on me that Melissa had assaulted me for refusing to quietly disappear from Jake's life, only to discover months later that he wasn't worth fighting for in the first place. She'd committed a crime to defend a relationship that was doomed to fail for exactly the same reasons my relationship with him had failed. But ultimately, her growth or lack thereof wasn't my responsibility or concern. I'd done what I needed to do to protect myself and seek justice, and whatever happened to her after that was between her and the consequences of her own choices. The restraining order was still in effect, which meant that even if I'd wanted to reach out to compare notes about Jake's behavior, I couldn't legally do so. Instead, I focused on building relationships with people who added value to my life, who supported my goals and respected my boundaries, who treated me with the kindness and consideration I'd learned I deserved. Emma remained my closest confidant and strongest supporter, but I also developed deeper friendships with colleagues, neighbors, and people I met through various activities and interests. When David and I got engaged 3 years after we met, I found myself thinking about how different this relationship felt from my time with Jake. David's proposal was thoughtful and genuine, based on a real understanding of who I was and what I wanted from life, rather than an attempt to lock down someone he saw as a convenient accessory to his own plans and ambitions. Planning our wedding gave me opportunities to reflect on how much my life had changed since the dark period with Jake and the traumatic aftermath with Melissa. I was surrounded by people who genuinely cared about me, engaged to someone who valued and supported me, pursuing career goals that excited and challenged me. The woman who had once been grateful for scraps of attention and affection had been replaced by someone who expected and received genuine love and respect. Emma served as my maid of honor, and during her speech at the reception, she talked about watching me transform from someone who had lost herself in an unhealthy relationship to someone who had found strength she didn't know she possessed. She mentioned the trial only obliquely, referring to it as a time when I'd stood up for myself against people who had tried to hurt me, but everyone who knew my story understood what she meant. The restraining order against Melissa was still in effect on my wedding day, which meant that even if she'd wanted to disrupt the celebration, she would have faced immediate arrest for violating the court's protection order. But I realized I wasn't even thinking about her anymore, wasn't scanning the guest list or worrying about potential confrontations. She had become irrelevant to my life, a chapter that was closed and no longer had any power to affect my happiness or security. When David and I exchanged vows, I promised to love and support him while maintaining my independence and personal goals, to build a partnership based on equality and mutual respect rather than dependency or control. He made similar promises, acknowledging that my strength and autonomy were part of what he loved about me, not obstacles to be overcome or managed. Looking back now, I understand that Melissa's attack was a turning point that forced me to choose between remaining a victim or becoming a survivor. By choosing to fight back, to seek justice, to refuse to be silenced or intimidated, I'd not only held her accountable for her actions, but had also reclaimed my own power and agency. The restraining order would eventually expire, the legal documents would be filed away, and the physical evidence of what happened would continue to fade. But the internal changes, the growth in self-respect and personal strength, the knowledge that I could handle whatever challenges life might present, those transformations were permanent, woven into the fabric of who I'd become. Sometimes I wondered what my life would have looked like if Jake had never cheated, if Melissa had never assaulted me, if I'd been allowed to continue living in the comfortable denial that had characterized my early 20s. But I realized that version of myself, while perhaps less wounded, would also have been less wise, less strong, less capable of recognizing and demanding the love and respect I deserved. The woman I'd become through surviving those experiences was someone I was proud to be, someone who could face challenges with courage and grace, someone who understood her own worth and wouldn't settle for anything less than she deserved. In the end, Melissa's attempt to destroy me had actually been the catalyst for the most important growth and transformation of my entire life. As I write this now, 5 years after that terrible day in the parking lot, I can honestly say that being assaulted was one of the worst things that ever happened to me, but fighting back and seeking justice was one of the best decisions I ever made. It taught me that I was stronger than I thought, braver than I believed, and more deserving of love and respect than I'd ever imagined. The scar on my scalp where Melissa ripped out my hair still serves as a daily reminder of what I survived and overcame. Sometimes when I'm brushing my hair or getting ready for work, I catch sight of that small patch where the hair grows in a slightly different direction, and I remember the woman I was that day, scared and humiliated and unsure of what to do next. But mostly, I remember the woman I became in response to that moment, someone who refused to be intimidated, who demanded justice when wronged, who built a life based on her own values and standards rather than other people's expectations. The assault was intended to silence and diminish me, but it ultimately taught me to use my voice more effectively and claim my space more confidently, and that's a victory that no one can ever take away from me. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.